Too quickly. Okay. Okay, let's just start with some breathing. Sorry, I forgot to say that. As usual, be mindful of the breath. And then to allow yourself to be inspired and to experience joyful devotion. Think that you're once again in the presence of the Buddha on Vulture's Mass Mountain. And in the presence of the special Sangha who attended the teachings on the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. Besides this sense of joy for having encountered, for having met such a awakened being, try to also generate a sense of gratitude for all the great opportunities we have. Especially learning about emptiness and the path to enlightenment. In order to remember that since we have these freedoms and opportunities, we shouldn't neglect those endless sentient beings who are deprived of these leisures, of these advantages. Visualize that they are all around you to remind us of their existence. And especially those we usually try to avoid for whatever reason. They're right in front of us. By remembering that they're essentially just like us. Wanting to be satisfied and not wanting to experience problems and difficulties. Generate what's called affectionate love. A sense of acceptance and closeness and sincere care. As if they're all a part of you. And then based on that affection, generate the wish for them to be free from any type of dissatisfaction and its cause. And the aspiration, may I personally be able to protect them from dissatisfaction and its cause. And allow that great compassion to then grow stronger. Giving rise to great courage, a profound inner strength that is determined to do whatever is necessary and however long it takes to dedicate my life and even my lives towards assisting sentient beings to attain liberation from dissatisfaction and its causes. Once again, that altruistic attitude gives way to the mind of enlightenment. The wish to become fully enlightened in order to do whatever it takes, however long it takes, to help sentient beings overcome dissatisfaction and its causes, leading them to a state of liberation or even enlightenment. And it's with this mind, with this motivation, that we'll continue learning about the Heart Sutra, reflecting on it and meditating on its meaning. So once again, think that you've generated this motivation in front of the Buddha and the Sangha. And let's then recite the prayers together to deepen that motivation. I take refuge until I'm enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my accumulations of generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit transmigratory beings. I take refuge until I'm enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my merits of generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit transmigratory beings. I take refuge until I'm enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my accumulations of generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit transmigratory beings. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings never be separated from the happiness that knows no suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free of attachment and hatred for those held close and distant. I have two announcements. So there are two events, one tonight, one tomorrow. And the question is whether you would like to participate. One is what's called Lama Chöpa, or Guru Puja, or offerings to the Lama. You're welcome to participate. It takes about 2 hours to go through it. You'll have a text right in front of you with the Tibetan, but also the English, so you can follow its meaning. I'll talk a little bit about it tonight. Tonight means this afternoon, to give you a sense of what it's all about, so you're not totally unaware of the different prayers and their meaning. But I need to know who would like to do, who would be interested. Could you raise your hands? Okay, that's everyone. You can send a message to come in. All right, because they need to prepare accordingly, because there's going to be offerings, kind of symbolic offerings, which at the end are, of course, divided then among everyone. So we'll get some sweets. But they're blessed, so you should eat them with an awareness of... No, but I'll talk about this a little bit in the afternoon. That's the first event. The second event will be tomorrow morning, really early. It could be earlier, so you're lucky it's not that early. It's usually before sunrise, but in this setting it's acceptable to have it a little later. I think it's around 6. It's taking the Mahayana precepts. So again, some of you may be aware of that, maybe you know about it. I'll speak about it this afternoon. I can see already these hands twitching. But it's just you, for a day, you really dedicate towards sentient beings, and you take some precepts, only for the day, so no vows for the rest of your life, no, just for that day. You eat before lunch to keep your body light and light and more to have a body that's more conducive to meditation. So you only eat up to lunch, or your last meal will be at lunch. And then there are other precepts, not to wear jewelry, to not play music, and I mean, it's pretty easy, you're doing that already, pretty much. I mean, maybe taking off some of your jewelry if you want to. I mean, if you don't wear it with attachment. I'll go through the precepts, there are 8 of them. They're called also the 8 one-day vows, if done with the pratimoksha with a motivation to become liberated, to become self-liberated. So these vows are also found in other traditions, in the fundamental tradition, or the fundamental vehicle tradition. But here they're done in the context of the Mahayana, or I should say the universal vehicle motivation of bodhicitta. Yeah, so I'll go through them today, in this afternoon. But it would be good to already know. So don't worry about these vows. The hardest is really not to eat in the evening, and the rest you're already refraining from anyway. But who's interested? I'd like to see. Okay, that's again. Okay, all right, that's almost everyone. So great, we can prepare that. We, as if I were to prepare. They can. All the stuff I'm doing. No. They can prepare the needed seats in the gompa, so you'll do it with the other course. You'll join the other course members and you'll do it together. Great. So that's done. I have a little left, of course, as you all know. We'll still got to talk about Tantra, and I'll do that tomorrow. I'll wrap up the text today, but I'm still not totally satisfied when it comes to applying what we learn to our daily life. It's such a challenge. That's the hardest. That is the hardest about Buddhist study and meditation. You see, in this tradition, in the Gelugpa tradition, there's a lot of emphasis on study. In other traditions, there's a lot of emphasis on doing retreats. Now, one thing I always like to talk about in this kind of setting, in a setting such as a course, that there's also sometimes some disharmony or some disagreement by the different traditions. But I think it's mainly based on a misunderstanding. Study is a technique, it's a method. A retreat is a technique, it's a method, it's a tool. Those are tools. Tools for what? To use the Dharma to transform our own mind. And that is difficult. That first step from, yeah, it's fun to study it, it's fun to do these retreats, versus these are personal instructions. and I'm going to apply this to my own life. So to actually internalize it. And sometimes there are followers of these different traditions who would say, oh, the Gelugpas, they're only interested in study. They're not interested in the Dharma, as in like practicing it. Then there are followers of the Gelugpa traditions who are saying, oh, these people from, for instance, the Kagyu tradition, they just jump right into retreat. They have no idea what they're doing. All this is wrong. Of course, you always have people, and they're usually exceptions, I'd say, who are only interested in study in the Gelugpa from the point of view of the, well, or following the Gelugpa tradition, just study, 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 and their egos may grow much bigger than before. I'm such a great this, I'm such a great debater. So it's really important, of course, to be careful about it and not make the study and possibly your success in this study increase your pride, your arrogance, and so forth. But the same danger is there also with doing a lot of retreats. That some people are like, I did this, I did that, I did 3 years of this, oh, I did this in the mountains, you know, like, whoa. It's all about our self-centeredness that easily slips in and uses any opportunity to feel special, whether it's through the study or retreat or, I don't know, running a center or whatever. I mean, there's so many Dharma activities. So that is the greatest challenge, and we don't do ourselves a favor, of course, obviously, to allow our self-centeredness run wild. So extremely important, but really hard, because like the self-centeredness is like, it's so strong, and it doesn't want to be just weakened and so forth. So there's just going to be that reaction from our own mind. Therefore, to understand and respect these other traditions for what they are. For some, this tradition is more suitable, for others that. So I've met many great practitioners who from the outset, yeah, they study a lot, they're in the monastery, they're not even aware of them doing any kind of retreat. Then they pass away and they're in the clear light, you know, for a while or a longer time or whatever. And it becomes obvious. I mean, even to some who were close to them, their great spiritual qualities were obvious just being in their presence. But then, of course, when they pass away, it may become more obvious. Not that every great practitioner remains in the clear light anyway. But then there are also others, of course, of the other traditions who may not really know, don't have an obvious kind of background in studies, but you don't always need to study in the way that you study in this tradition. So you can still do a lot of study with like a personal teacher. I mean, to actually practice, the whole debating and so forth is not that important. I mean, it depends on the person. For some, it's really helpful to really get a deeper understanding of the meaning. But I also know people who haven't debated and still have a really deep understanding of the meaning. So it's just a tool. For some, it's very beneficial. And for some, it may just be an obstacle, that whole analysis the whole time. It may be an obstacle. So it's just a matter of finding out what suits you best. Okay, having said that, so this tradition is better than this, and especially in the Tibetan Buddhist traditions, I mean, they're all equally setting forth the teachings of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, the teachings of Nagarjuna and his spiritual sons, as they're called, his main disciples. And the way to do it is just slightly different. But that's good, because they're different people and different needs. Okay, having said that, I want to return to this challenge of putting it into practice. Now, my difficulty here is that this text is really advanced. Of course, if it was a text on just how to deal with anger, for instance, it's much more obvious to us how we can apply this. But what I really like, just from your comments, some of you come to me during the breaks, some say it in class, this wish to really apply it in your daily life. And I really appreciate that, because not everyone's got that. You know, some people are just interested in learn a little bit more about emptiness because it's just fun. But my job is basically then to remove this gap between this intellectual understanding and my personal life. And so all I can do is point it out again and again. In the end, I don't know your individual lives. I don't know what you're going through, what your challenges are. So I can only guess and take a few examples. What we did yesterday, and some of you remarked that, and it's totally true, this is so beyond us. And I studied that just as you did in this setting here. I studied it also as part of the study at the institute that I received my education, Buddhist education. So the challenge was how to make that relevant. So it wasn't like, oh yeah, that's what I'm doing on a day. Oh, this is the next step I have to go through, because no way, it's like totally beyond me. But what I tried to trigger was the sense of joy that there's this opportunity, that I can do this one day, that if the Buddha did it, I can do it. To also realize that's part of it. However low our self-esteem may be, but to kind of bypass that and get a sense, those are the possibilities. That's what I can do. And a sense of just joy, so an emotional response in that sense of, wow, incredible. The sky's the limit. I mean, what I can do with my mind, that is so beautiful. And it gives you a lot of self-confidence. Everyone can do that. It's very clear. The emphasis is very much on that. Anyone can do it, no matter who they are. You just have to take the first step. Just have to make the decision and then act accordingly. Everyone can do it. So that would be one way of dealing with it, at least to get a sense of joy and know this is where I'm going. Of course, if that's not where you want to go, then okay, but at least, wow, at least those are the possibilities. This is the power of the mind. So that would be one way of dealing with it. But of course, we also need to come back to our daily challenges, right? To, well, being with other people. That's most of the time our greatest challenge, isn't it? Being with others, being with ourselves. That's already a great challenge. And on top of that, being with others who are similarly controlled by the root misperceptions, self-centeredness, and so forth. So, one step, I mean, someone mentioned the example that you discussed in the discussion group. So it didn't let me go. It's like the whole evening was like, the neighbor and the dog, right? The neighbor beats the dog. I hope I understood that right. You gave the example of it. Is that right? Yeah. So how to deal with that, right? Really, it's not easy. So no neighbor, no dog, no... No. That's not the purpose of the Heart Sutra. Right? No, I know you, no nose and so forth, and then no neighbor, no face of the neighbor, no stick of the neighbor, and so. Okay. So how do we go about this? How do we close this gap between? Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I was thinking, what is the first approach? You see, I'm not saying it is right to beat a dog, especially a dog. I mean, sometimes, to tell you the truth, I have a much harder time when something happens to an animal versus a human. Oh, it's unbearable. I cannot watch something like a video. I can watch a human being beaten, but I can't watch animals. It's so much worse because they can't do anything. They're so caught in their inability of communicating and, yeah, anyway. Or communicating in a certain way, or defending themselves. So, but besides that, usually my first, and I'm just talking about myself, my first response is me. It's like I see everything from my own perspective. I'm used to see it that way, everything. So, my judgment of the situation, my everything, me, and I take it personally. I really think that's an important point, is taking it personally, right? Here with beating the dog, okay, that's a little bit far-fetched, taking it personally. But the way people act around us, oftentimes, when they don't smile, when they're, you smile at them and then don't smile back, we take that personally, right? It's like you're like full of compassion and bodhicitta, and they go, and you're like, how do I practice bodhicitta like that? Right? You take it personally. Right away, it's like me. I moved away from the dog on purpose for now, right? It's just that reaction in our interactions. We take it personally. I see it from me, they didn't. But to now, based on the understanding that is my perspective, this is my perspective, this is I, but this is I, there's another I from their perspective. So what could their perspective be? Maybe they have a really bad day. Maybe they have a terrible day. They woke up in the morning and they're miserable. Maybe they come from a culture where you don't necessarily smile that much, right? Where it's not encouraged. There are cultures like that. I know I've heard of the Korean culture that men are not necessarily, it's a manly thing to be serious. So they don't necessarily smile back as a cultural thing. Then there also, what else is there? It may be just, who's this guy smiling? I don't know her, right? Like, what do they want? They have some ulterior motive. They smile at me. I remember one time, my uncle, my godfather, he's like my godfather. It's like he's the person my parents appointed to be the person if they ever passed away when I was little. If they passed away, he would look after me. So anyway, I've always had that special bond to him. But he's very critical of everything. So he kind of supported me, but he was suspicious of the whole Buddhism things. It doesn't help that he's really it's very strongly rooted in Christian faith, and some of those the contradictions, of course, that you find in Christianity and Buddhism. Anyway, so every time I'm home, we talk on the phone or we meet, and he's always asking me, so first of all, he was always asking, when are you done with your studies? Because it's so important to start your career. When are you done with your studies? And I'm like, I don't know, it's still going on. Oh, okay. And then anyway, we get to talk and he asks me questions. And one day I said, well, look at His Holiness the Dalai Lama. As an example, I thought, wow, that's a perfect example. So I talked, and he's like, I don't like the Dalai Lama. And I'm like, what? He says he smiles too much. And I was like, what? He smiles too much? There is too much smiling? Yeah, there's too much smiling. There's something. So I realized, after I put down the phone, that was during the time of the German Pope, who was more serious than the present one, right? So it's almost like, if you don't smile, you're a dignified spiritual person. You don't. Maybe there is that sense, For him, it was like when someone smiles too much, they're just naive and silly. Maybe that kind of sense. I don't know, right? Because it does exist in certain cultures. Certain prime ministers or presidents, they don't go around, right? They're like, right? So I kind of got that. Oh, it's just a different way of relating to, and that accounts also for, when we go around and smile at people after a Buddhist course. Come down to McLeod and people are like, what's going on? This weird person is smiling at me. What do they want? The thing is, just smiling in itself, we may have a sincere motivation, but my point is, if the other person reacts differently. This is just a silly example, of course, but we may be taken aback when this person doesn't react likewise. And to then not be upset and go like, oh, I'm not going to do that again. Stop smiling from now on. No, but instead to put ourselves into the other person's shoes, right? Continue smiling. Honestly, even if I sometimes don't smile back, sometimes someone smiles at me, and I'm so busy with myself, I forget to smile, and they're gone. I'm like, did you see? Did you see? I did smile back. But I missed the point. They're all gone. Right? So, therefore, what I'm trying to say is that our motivation should be there to be for the benefit of the other. And then the person reacts the way they react. It doesn't matter. And that is also what we call unconditional love, right? Unconditional love, to love others. Right now, our love is conditional. We have the thought, may you be happy, and may you give something in return because I've been so kind. It sneaks in. It sneaks in. We're so used to it. So be gentle with yourself. It'll sneak in for the longest time, right? But then you train, and so there's no response. No one is going to praise you for what you've done. You do what you do, but you keep quiet about it. You don't tell others about it. Ooh, that's the next step, right? You do it because it's the right thing, to not want to receive praise. And that's already hard. I mean, just that response of a smile back is kind of like a reward, because we feel just as good as they do when we smile at them. So to watch our mind in these little situations, when we help someone and they react in a totally negative way, well, gosh, react with compassion for that and not regret that you've helped them. That's the first step. So we start from here. If you read the 8 verses of mind training, which I mentioned earlier on, the 8 verses, so in there, they're all mental trainings. So no matter what, no matter how we're treated, our love and compassion will not be dampened by that treatment, by the reaction of the other person and so forth. And it doesn't mean, of course, that we become a punching mat, a doormat for others to walk over. That's the other extreme. But internally, our love remains the same. And it takes me always back to parents again. You know, like parents, and I'm saying that I'm not naive about like there are parents who are like this and parents who are like that. I mean, there are different types. But what we consider to be good parents are parents who love their children equally. And if some has some faults and so forth, they can go beyond that. They can see past that and still love them for who they are. Still love them for who they are. Therefore, in the same way here, this is what we're trying to do. This is what we're learning. And it takes baby steps initially, and sometimes 1 step forward and 3 backwards, and that's also okay. That's part of the process. Yeah? So start with little, and try. You know, you smile and no one smiles back. You help others and nothing comes back. The whole point is that you've done it. That's the reward. And again, if they react in a certain way, you also need to be stern at times. But that sternness comes from care and love. You can be as tough as it gets. Some of the most compassionate teachers I know, they can be very stern and strict. So don't get me wrong. I'm only talking about your mental response, not your physical response. And I gave you the example of His Holiness in certain situations being very stern and very scary. But again, this is strong compassion, that is wrathful compassion. Have you ever noticed these Buddha figures, as I like to call them? I don't like to use the word deities so much because that can be misconstrued as if there were all these different gods. No, but these wrathful entities. Pretty wrathful here, maybe not as clearly. Wait, how wrathful? Yeah, a little grumpy, but anyway. Yeah. So, I mean, it has more of like a grumpy, I don't want to be disrespectful, but it's not what we consider wrathful. But yeah, here you have the wrathful Mahakala, for instance. So like, that is just an archetype of, it's considered to be some kind of archetype of wrathful compassion. Wrathful compassion. So all these deities, because we're so fixated on shapes and colors, we utilize that tendency we have, and to learn certain qualities as part of our practice here in the tantric context, to learn possibly wrathful compassion. But compassion, the emphasis on compassion, that wrathful aspect is just how it manifests itself. So it can be in that form of like saying, enough is enough, stop behaving like that, you're harming yourself and others. But it's a very temperate kind of reaction because it's not extreme. It only becomes extreme because our anger, our aversion, our resentment, they're extreme emotions. which lead our wrathful reaction, or which transform our wrathful reaction into something extreme, which then leads to an extreme response from the other person, right? Whereas if it's tempered by compassion and love, the other person doesn't feel overwhelmed by that reaction. It's hard to put it into words, but I think we all know what is meant. When someone is full of anger and disciplines us, we feel offended. We feel misunderstood because there's this extreme response that possibly doesn't correspond to the action. Versus a tempered kind of, motivated by, driven by love and compassion, a strictness that only goes that far, and that corresponds, that is much more likely to correspond to the action of that person. So they see, okay, that was my mistake, that I should stop. If it's an extreme response, they feel like I'm totally misunderstood, as if I only do negative things. I also do great stuff. So the response, that negative response the person is getting because of their non-virtue, their undisciplined behavior, or whatever, that seems to go overboard. And they just need to defend themselves. And if you need to defend yourself, then that needs to, and that's also out of resentment, and you have a fight. It leads to a fight. Okay, so having said all that, it's important to keep your internal, to keep it measured, to not be carried away by resentment and so forth. So introspection is very important at all times. Now, having said all that, how do you react to the neighbor beating the dog? Right? How do you react to the neighbor beating the dog? I was thinking, first thing is to befriend your neighbor. It's a good idea, befriend your neighbor. To jump in between and say, how can you beat a dog? Will probably be like, mind your own business. Who do you think you are? That's oftentimes, unfortunately, the reaction. If the dog is beaten up in a really violent way, where you may just go in between, if you can. Of course, it depends on. But if you know it happens on a daily basis and the dog is not physically maimed or in any way terribly injured, you may want to choose a slower approach and befriend your neighbor, right? And get to know them. So, I mean, this sounds a little silly, and maybe it's anyway a good idea. If you live next to them, you might as well become friends with them, and start talking with them, right? Become friends with them. I remember when I grew up, it was really funny. We had this grumpy, weird neighbor, and my parents and this grumpy old neighbor, they didn't get along. They got along with his wife, but not with him. And I thought that was so weird. How can someone be so grumpy? So I had this weird idea, because he had these kids, and maybe he was different in a different context. So I just did this weird thing. I always went up to him and I talked to him. They said nothing, no Buddhist. So this was nothing Buddhist. But I was so fascinated by someone he could always be so grumpy. How can you always be like that, right? I just didn't get it. And so I wanted to smear honey around his mouth, kind of thing. I wanted to see whether he could like me, right? I had this he doesn't know me, and I didn't throw the leaves on his side or whatever, right? I didn't feel it was fair, that by association. And I started being my best self. Hi, how are you? You've got such a cute dog. I didn't like the dog, but I mean, it was okay, but it barked too much for my liking. So anyway, and we became friends at some point. I don't know, it was really weird. And I got to know a totally different side of him. And he was always nice and friendly. In the end, my parents asked me to tell him things. Right? I became friends with him. And it was such a good experience. It started off with the totally wrong motivation. I wanted him to like me. Yeah, now that I remember, I said it was not Buddhist. It was not Buddhist at all. It was just, no, I didn't do anything to him. He could like me, others like me, so he might as well. And yeah, I did exactly that. I flattered him. Anyway, but that was a really good experience, because I thought, he's not as bad as they think. He's actually quite nice. And then he told me stories when he was a kid. I never heard these stories. I thought they were really interesting. I hated them when my grandma told them because they were all like moral and they told me how to behave. I didn't want to hear those stories, how much she sacrificed and how I should. No, but his stories I liked, right? So I never forget that neighbor, and eventually he passed away. But that was a good lesson. My first lesson, that the most grumpiest, the weirdest person out there, underneath, there's also a sensible person who wants to be loved, who is friendly when you're friendly to them. Really, that was my first teacher, my grumpy neighbor. And so you can discover this in anyone. You just have to find a way to access it, right? So when they're grumpy, give them some space, okay? If you have a neighbor, but talk to them every now and then until you realize, okay, now they're closing, okay, wait for the next opportunity. And it's become a little bit of a game sometimes when there's a especially difficult person to see when can I access that warmness. And you need to what I call, you need to apply your mirror neurons. Have you ever heard of the mirror neurons? It's just the neuroscientific way of saying put yourself into the other person's shoes. But it's kind of like, it's not so much putting yourself into the other person's shoes, but be in tune with them. Watch their every reaction and be in tune with that, right? Like, okay, so, oh, that's an expression of annoyance. I better back off. That's an expression of, they start looking around. Okay, they're distracted, they're thinking of something else, wrap it up. Or they don't want to talk about that. Okay, maybe something else. Allow them to start. Yeah? And to totally, like, you merge with that person. There's no distance between you become them. There's no sense me here and you over there. I found that really works. I found that really works with difficult people. And before long, you access that beauty inside. And that is so helpful to think all sentient beings can be close. I mean, even people who start wars and who do horrific things and engage in all sorts of terrible, underneath it, there's a person who's vulnerable, who has fear, and who's driven by greed, ignorance, and so forth. And they just want to be loved as well, like everyone else. They don't want to be alone. They feel lonely, possibly, because they totally isolate themselves from everyone else. But that I find so rewarding. Like I said, I'm not trying to suggest that I had any Buddhist way of thinking. Not at all. Not at all. I was the opposite. But my grumpy neighbor really was a good teacher. So, therefore, going back to the lady who beats the dog, if you can make the time and you want her to stop, don't force it, don't go about it too quickly, but befriend her, or at least give her the feeling that you really like her. And then slowly, right? Talk about your love of dogs. And sometimes when you hear the dog sounds, you feel like, oh, that's so sad. And maybe kind of like, I'm sure you have your reason, but sometimes, I don't know, I would beat the dog. Are there other methods? To be really careful. And again, be very careful in her reaction, or I keep saying her, somehow it's from me, a woman. But anyway, or his reaction, whatever. You see what I'm saying? It's a slow process, but it's all based on our understanding that underneath we're all the same, and putting ourselves into that person's shoes. I mean, putting ourselves, like, it's not really merging with that person. You see what I'm saying? It's that I have a hard time to put it into words, but to close the gap between us, and possibly also come to understand where she or he's coming from. We can infer, we don't need to know 100%, that maybe they had a very aggressive parent. I mean, no one becomes aggressive for no reason. No one. There are causes and conditions that lead to aggressiveness. And the thing is, sometimes we feel a little superior to such a person. I'll tell you one story. One thing that really hit me. You see, like growing up in Germany after the Second World War, of course, there's this whole guilt of what happened. My grandfather was a big Nazi, for instance, but that was less an issue because he was long gone when I was born. But it was the whole kind of collective guilt. And my father remarried after my parents divorced, and I was very close, I am very close to his wife, and very close to her mother, who became 100. She lived until the age of 100. She passed away 2 years ago. And we had a really good time. I really liked her. I really, I always liked to go and see her. And she had these great stories from the past. And she knew that every year I spent some time in Israel, traveling from here to Israel. I have some friends there and giving some teachings. Anyway, so she knew that. And one day she said, "You're going to Israel, how's that?" You know, she was really sweet about it. And then she said, "I don't like Jews." Oh my God. Oh my God. She said, "I don't like Jews." And I was like, oh my God, she's a Nazi. This lovely woman. I was so in shock. I didn't know what to say. And then I collected myself and I said, "Why?" And so she said, like, she gave this whole story. She had Jewish classmates and, you know, and she gave this whole Nazi kind of, you know, I was so shocked. I was like, oh my God, she's 97, no way, or 96 at the time. I'm not going to change her way of thinking. Should I try and convince her? No, nothing has convinced her so far. So I was totally like, I was so paralyzed. And this beautiful lady suddenly turned into a devil. Because we're also raised like in this way. This is so terrible. This is so awful. And so I had this really strong reaction. And my whole Buddhist thing went out of the window. And I pretty much wrapped it up and I went home. And I didn't want to tell anyone. I thought her grandchildren are going to hate her. I can't tell anyone. But at some point, one of my stepbrothers, I talked to him a little bit, and he said, "Did you find out Granny, she's a real Nazi?" And I'm like, "Oh, you know?" He said it jokingly, you know, he said it jokingly. But he still loved her, so he knew he actually knew. And then I thought about it, and I thought about it, and I thought about it. And I thought about it from her perspective. And I thought, okay, so this is not justifying anything, but she was definitely brainwashed. She was a young woman at the time, and I don't think she was a perpetrator. She was too young for that. But she was like in her early 20s, I think, when the war was. So and she was responsible for her own actions. She was not 5 or 6 years old, but still. So I thought, the one thought I came to was, how dare I judge others when I don't know if I wouldn't turn into a Nazi if I were in that same situation. So that helped me a little bit. I'm not saying, oh, everyone is just, they couldn't do otherwise. They couldn't help it, right? They were in that circumstances. I don't want to say that, but I easily judge people and think I'm a little bit better. I wouldn't do that. But given the circumstances, I don't know. If I had very aggressive parents, I would be a maybe aggressive person who beats dog. Abuse other people. So there's a fine line between saying we need to stop this. We need to, you know, if it, okay, in her case, as a 96-year-old woman, she wasn't going to start any, I don't know, neo-Nazi group or something. So, but I'm saying if there are these situations, given an example, we need to stop this to the best of our ability, but to also at the same time see where people are coming from and try to understand them and not feel I'm better than them. Because given the circumstances, I may be just like them. And I tell you a story of my good friend Boaz from Israel. Now I have to be careful about what I say. But I still found, he's a Buddhist. He has been a Buddhist for many years. We actually started off, I was still a lay person. No, I was a nun already. But he was here and I was here. And so we kind of became friends over the years, and then I met him again when I went to Israel. So he told me this interesting, he made this interesting statement. We were down in Lama Zopa Rinpoche's house one day during a course. He attended one of the courses I did. And he said, and I talked about this whole guilt I have as a German person, that this is really deep-rooted and it's very difficult for me to access it from a Buddhist point of view, right? That feeling of guilt, although rationally it doesn't make sense because I wasn't even born then. So anyway, we discussed this, and he said, there's an interesting story that he once met a German woman who had a relationship with a Palestinian man who lived in a building in the Gaza Strip on which the Israeli soldiers used to pee down from. And he said this Palestinian guy had a hard time with Israeli soldiers because they would use his house like a toilet, pee down from it. And he said, I peed down from that house. When I was a soldier, I peed down from that house. We didn't have a toilet anywhere, so we all peed down from that house, right? And he's like, I also have a sense of guilt. I get that. I also did things at the time I'm not proud of. I peed down from their house. But he said, I became really good friend with this Palestinian man. And then we talked about guilt and so forth. And he said, wouldn't it be funny if you, at the time when all this happened, were Jewish and I was German? I kept saying, I think I feel guilty towards you. You are on this side. And he said, no, but I also did something I felt guilty for. So he described this story and he said, I made up for it. And he also said, how about your whole guilt now, how about you were at that time Jewish and I was a Nazi? That doesn't mean, I'm not trying to take away and say, what happened to especially Jewish people at that time. I mean, no, but I'm saying we're so identified with a certain group. We identify so much. So I identified so strongly with being German, though I don't know, I may have been something else at the time. So that helped me a little bit to overcome that feeling of guilt, which, of course, that it never should never happen again is very clear. But it was an emotional response that paralyzed me. Okay? That couldn't make me feel rationally. So I'm just saying, not identifying too strongly with one group over another, to understand we're all human beings. We're all human beings. So it's not a matter of group. It's not a matter of belonging to this or that. We all make mistakes. We all accumulate, and it doesn't matter what group we belong to. But underneath, and I keep stressing that, underneath, we have a lot more in common than differences, to put it simply, right? Okay, so having said all this, okay, there's so much to it. I'm going right now, I'm talking a lot, but I'm trying to take you through these thought processes that I've gone through over the years. It took a lot of time. A lot of thinking, a lot of reflection. And this takes me back to also what I'm trying to say. It's all part of analytical meditation. It's like digesting what I learned about Buddhism underneath, in the sense of also, of course, inherently, there's none of these characteristics that we have, and very closely related to any kind of sense of ultimate nature is impermanence. That we are constantly changing, we're never the same. We are born in very different situations. We identify very strongly with one over the other. The enemies of this life could be the lovers of our next life, and the lovers of this life could be our enemies in the future life. And there's a beautiful story that I'll tell you in a while about Shariputra and so forth, but it comes a little later. The point is just that our relationships constantly change, we change, our characteristics change. There's nothing inherent and solid. But what is important is that deeper level of the mental consciousness that is pure for everyone. It changes moment by moment, but it doesn't change into something else. Whereas all our limitations, they keep changing into something. They're malleable, they're changeable, right? And to get a vaster sense of what is going on around us, we are too close-minded. We have this tendency to be too close-minded. A vaster sense of what is possible in the future, of where this person is coming from, what is their background, a vaster sense of what their other characteristics are. Okay? So, let me now wrap it up. What I'm trying to say with all this chit-chat, what I'm trying to say is, right now, I'm close-minded because I see only my perspective. My perspective. That is my main perspective. How can I widen it? I can widen it being in the present, only from the point of view of the present, by taking in other people. What are their views? What are their needs? And then I can widen it further. I perceive one part of them, but there are many other parts of them. Dependence on parts. Many other parts. Okay? So perceive that as well. So the other person's perspective, other perspectives, and all the different parts of that person. Logically knowing there must be a lot more to that person. So I widen it in that way. I can also expand it to taking the past into consideration. What are the causes and conditions that turned them into who they are now? What are the causes and conditions that made me who I am right now? Also my limitations, to be forgiving, of course, with my own limitations. I shouldn't totally neglect myself, because although I feel I'm the center of the universe, I can be so harsh and so unforgiving when it comes to me, that I need to also consider these times when I'm very harsh with myself and understand it's also causes and conditions that gave rise to those. But that is true for others as well. Some people have less choices, have less opportunities to make the correct decision versus, well, maybe myself or, again, other people. So to go back in the past as well and get a fuller sense of what created the presence. And also think of the future. Due to our potential now and the actual nature of our mind, the possibilities that lie in the future. That maybe this person is terrible right now, but they also have the potential to become a Buddha. And to recognize that, and to not perceive them as pure evil, right? Pure evil, right? As sometimes we have that sense. Okay, for a while I can see Beate has a question. Yes, go ahead.
Actually, I totally agree with what you just told us. That's quite obvious. But what did you do? For instance, I have relatives who are really in this neo-Nazi ideas. And if we have a kind of family gathering and they are putting out their weird ideas, you have to react somehow. You have to tell them, I don't share your ideas. And
of course.
That can easily come to a distance.
So some conflict. Yeah. Yes.
Conflict.
A distance could be a healthy distance. It doesn't have to be an emotional distance. Sometimes we have to, you're right, a healthy distance is good. To give you another example, Ram asked me about talking about lust. You wanted me to talk about lust. I won't say it right now. I will still. I haven't forgotten. But lust, L-U-S-T, lust. Yes, lust, like strong lust. For monks and nuns, what we're supposed to do in certain situations when there are strong feelings of lust, like sexual lust, stay away. But it's not saying, I don't like this person. Emotionally, I don't want. No, emotionally, you care. You can still care for that person. You just stay away. End of story, for the time being. It's just healthier for both involved. But you know what's really nice? As you asked this question, I was reminded of one of my favorite producer of documentaries. I don't think I can pronounce his name correctly. Louis Theroux. Have you ever heard of Louis Theroux? He's a genius. You haven't? Oh my God. He is French. He has French relatives, so the French name, but he's actually British. And he does these brilliant documentaries. Louis and the pedophiles, Louis and the Nazis, Louis and the Orthodox Jews, Louis and the... Okay, so what does he do? He wants to get to know these groups, and he befriends them. He befriends them. And he shows you the human side of that person, And he shows you, yeah, they have these bizarre views. It's totally obscure. But you don't react with hatred. You see that they're misguided. You still don't, you don't change your view on that. Anyway, so like sometimes there's this emotional distance that we have towards them, and we just turn away emotionally. That's our problem, and that's where the divide comes into existence. So he befriends. I'm not talking about neo-Nazis. These are the most extreme Nazis I've ever met, I've ever seen. In the United States, where you have a lot of freedom, communities can live on their own and live pretty much independently. You don't have to send them to public school. You can home train them. And there's this group of Nazis who, like, they greet each other with that terrible greeting. They have Nazi flags everywhere. And the children sing Nazi songs in front of everyone. And they're taught by their parents Nazi ideology. So he befriended them. He befriended the main person of them, and he's such a nice person. You know, he's like really good with them. He's very calm and sweet and so friendly. And he starts talking to them, and he's so skillful about it. He's so skillful, and they really like him, Louis Theroux. They really like him. Oh, hey, Louis, come to see. And he's like, I want to know more about this. I'm interested. I'm not a Nazi, but I'm interested. So they're like, okay. So they have this garage and this weird music, this kind of aggressive. It's not the kind of typical, I don't know, fatherland kind of song, whatever music, but it's still very aggressive Nazi music. And these children who are like, anyway, it's very disturbing. But he talks to them and befriends them. And then he said to one of them, what would you say if I were Jewish? And they were like, what? Are you Jewish? He said, I'm not going to say it, but what do you think? They like him. The problem is they really like him now. And then he's maybe Jewish. He never gives it away. He isn't, by the way. But he says, like, I could be. So what about, you like me, right? So he has these really good conversations with them. How am I different? Up to you heard that I was Jewish. What has it have to do with anything? So he's really skillful, and he has these discussions. And he says, look, I'm just trying to understand your viewpoint. Explain it to me better. So they feel understood. They try to explain it. But at the same time, he's quite skillful in bringing his own views in. And he's saying, you like me. There's nothing about me just being Jewish. Where's that Jewishness? I mean, he doesn't put in those words. That's just me interpreting a little bit more. But that's how I heard that's how my memory is a little skewed. But the point is that I thought he was so skillful. And to show the human side, I really like that. I really like that. And he said, I will never agree with you. Let's agree that we disagree. And they were fine with it. And, you know, to have another beer, okay. And the thing was, I think this was something like to be very clear, but to also allow discussion to some degree and say, look, I'm trying to understand you, explain it to you, and sometimes enabling them to analyze, and you enable them to see, maybe it doesn't make that much sense, to not question it, but say, I want to know more. How do you feel about it? You see, for instance, this thing about the Jewishness, you're saying there's something wrong about, what makes them Jewish? What is it? Is their blood different? Is there, you know, and so forth. Or another race, another ethnicity, really. I mean, Jewish is not really, it's more a religion. Okay, there are some ethical differences because of Jewish people marrying among, you know, other Jewish people, but in actuality, not really. But like having a different skin color, so what we call a different ethnicity. Underneath that very thin layer, where's the difference? So to analyze it and say, I'm trying to understand. I'm trying to understand where you're coming from. Explain to me further. Why? What is it? And what about people from other countries? Neo-Nazis usually very much opposed to who's going to do certain jobs, right? I mean, it's terrible, but a lot of Germans expect to get the better jobs. So if no foreigners were to come, would you do it? So appreciating that, the great culture they're introducing, the good food there. Don't you like certain foods they're introducing? We're learning more. So kind of like, you can discuss with them, but you need to first befriend them. You need to befriend them, as Louis did, and find the part of them that you like. Find that part of you, because they do have parts. Connect with their beauty, because there's some beauty. And show your own. And once you connect on that level, you can talk. You can talk. And you need to respect them. You need to respect them for their views. Respect is really important. Respect for another person. Respect for the person, not for their views. I should put it this way. Respect them for having certain views, not for those views. This is just as the Dalai Lama, this is Holiness the Dalai Lama says. Forgive the person, don't forgive the action. To draw a line between the person and their actions. So we're not condoning their actions. We respect them having certain views, but we would not condone these views. Does that make sense? And so to respect the person, show them you have a certain respect for them for other reasons. Maybe they're really good at repairing cars. I can barely fill my mom's car with petrol. I can do that. But someone is really good at preparing. I mean, that is a quality. Maybe they're very kind to their children and very patient with love, whatever. So to find that good quality, and if you then want to befriend them, or if you want to have a conversation, if they don't like you, they're never going to listen to you. If they kind of like you, there's a level on which you connect, you can do much more. Does that make sense? Yeah. So with this elderly woman, I was even nicer to her than before. And I would talk about how wonderful Israel is, when there were other people around, because she didn't dare to say that. She didn't dare to say that. And I would say, it's so wonderful, and the people are so kind. The food is incredible. It's the Holy Land, and which was the truth. I wasn't lying to her. And first she was like, but then there were parts that she did like, she liked to travel, so she heard about that. And I tried to bring it in. And in that way, it was on a friendly basis. And I don't know whether she ever agreed or not. But we could talk to each other. We continued to talk. Yeah, I think that is so important. To me, Louis is a really good example. The pedophiles. I mean, wow. We have such a hatred for pedophiles. But we need to distinguish between those who have tendencies and who act on them. Who have tendencies and who act on them. Right? And don't get me wrong. Please, I'm not trying to support pedophiles or anything. No, it's terrible. And the victims should be the first to think of. But also not to push them away and to hate them so that they're not integrated in society, and they can, being loners, they go even more out of their way and maybe abuse someone out of their hatred and I don't know, whatever. Do you see what I'm saying? So when Louis befriended the pedophiles, I was aghast. I thought, oh, how can you be around these people? That's just terrible. But he showed to me this other side of that person. He showed to me that other side. And there was a sense, it's just a human being. So how can I be so harsh? My resentment and my dislike of them was over the top. Okay, sorry, I've really talked for a long time now. But this takes time. This takes time. Nitsan.
I had this string of thought yesterday in discussion group that I want to see if you... it's about the way emptiness shows up for me in daily life. So for the past 10 years I've been vegan. And when people ask me, what do you miss about like milk, meat, eggs? I always say like I don't miss it. It's not it's not a food for me. In some way, I feel this is kind of an understanding of emptiness in the regard of like meat is not food for me. It's not inherently it doesn't have the inherent
quality of being food.
Yeah. So
nice.
In some way, we all have something that we are unconventional about in society. In life. And I think everyone has many of things.
Mm-hmm.
So in some way, it's very hard for me to be disciplined, but being vegan is non-issue.
Mm-hmm.
So in some ways, I'm inspiring myself to be disciplined the way I am with other things in my life. So in the same way, maybe as we are unconventional in some things, we can also look at unconventional reality different ways.
Very good. Nitzang is actually bringing us back into what matters, which is emptiness, which is part of this course. Wonderful. Thank you. Very good. She's making a very important point. I really like what she said. What is good, that all of us may be unconventional about some things. Recognize, whereas everyone else feels it's inherent. You see a chicken and you go, food. Right? For some people, they see a chicken and they see food. Maybe for a lot of people. When they see a dog, they don't see food. Unless they come from a certain culture where they eat dogs, which is also possible. So my point is here, what Nitzan is saying, in her case, it's non-vegan, it's dairies, right? It's milk and cheese and so forth. For us, it's food. For us, it's food that makes us feel in a certain way. So it seems inherent in that. So how it seems to be inherently a pleasant food. And therefore, we have a hard time giving it up. But in her case, that is not her perception. She doesn't have the perception. I think that's beautiful. To her, there's nothing inherent, and it's easy for her not to do it. And she came to understand that since it's not inherent to her, that this is pleasant food, she could give it up. Now, all she needs to do is basically transfer that to other things. It is inherent in this person to give me pleasure. It isn't. It is inherent in this, that, and the other to give me pleasure. Well, if I don't see it that way, then it's not that. That's really profound. Right? Very nice. It's exactly that. We need to find how we need to become aware how our objects of lust, bringing in Ram's question, our objects of lust, our objects of desire, even our objects of aversion, seem to suggest some inherent, well, in the case of aversion, inherent negativity, right? Versus something positive, an object of attachment, an inherent pleasure within them. Instead of recognizing there's just a sensation in the mouth and the belly, and it's just how I interpret it, right? And sometimes all it needs is some rotten egg, and I'm off eggs for the rest of my life because it has an inherent sickness to it, right? So, but I'm not saying go into extreme, don't eat rotten meat to become a vegetarian. But the point is, yes, it's a really profound point. I really like that. It's so simple in a way, that example, and still really powerful. Feeling, recognizing your own sense, there's something inherent in that. And not just that, recognizing it, this inherent sense, and due to our sense of something being there inherently good, how that is also exaggerated. How it's exaggerated, right? Which takes me, of course, to resentment. In the case of resentment, the person is a pedophile. It's evil, and all I see is the pedophile. I cannot see beyond that. I cannot see beyond that. And maybe only the mother of that pedophile can see beyond that and sees her child, right? In some situations, there are great artists who did horrible things with, abused women, right? And so they should be disciplined, they should be imprisoned, I totally agree. But everything they've done so far is gone. All that positive aspect, it's gone. They've gone from high up, and that's our extreme. We're putting them up on the pedestal, and then suddenly they fall to the bottom. And they do that with us. It happens to us as well. So that is our extreme way of looking at it. Seeing an extreme negativity in something, and it seems inherent, and we need to recognize that. That's really important. Very important. We also do it with words. They have an inherent meaning. Remember, we talked about words. That's why we're so easily insulted. If I use a certain word directed at you, in none of the letters is that negative meaning contained. Yeah? So in our conversations with people, like being so concerned about saying the right thing and being told the right thing, again, there's nothing inherent in words. I tell you a funny story, because I don't want to bore you any further. Before I continue, I'll tell you one funny story, just to relax. I was in Israel with a friend in a restaurant, and I wasn't hungry. She was hungry, but I wasn't. And I was just daydreaming. We were waiting for someone else, and I'm going through the menu, and I'm just totally daydreaming. And I see this word that I think is so beautiful, shakshuka. And I said to her, if I had a daughter, I'd call her shakshuka. Really? I like the name Shoshana. I know Shoshana is a totally old-fashioned name. And shakshuka is this tomato egg dish. I had to eat so much shakshuka. I don't even like shakshuka. I don't like shakshuka. I love hummus, but I don't like shakshuka. Anyway, the point is, that was such a good moment, right? It's like I want to call my child samosa or something, right? I mean, or I don't know, Momo. I know actually in Germany there's a Tibetan girl, her name is Tsampa. That's bad enough. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is, no, I'm not saying it's bad enough, but it's an unusual name. It's the main kind of dish for Tibetans, so it's called Tsampa. She's called Tsampa. But the point is, shakshuka in that moment meant to me a very beautiful, name. I would call my daughter that because I like the name Shoshana. And I know that's a really old-fashioned name, right? Yeah, very. But to me, it wasn't inherent. So you see, inherent, an old-fashioned name. You know, my sister, she picked a Hebrew name for her daughter. I found out it's very old-fashioned. Ziva. The name is Ziva. So when I tell Israelis, they're like, poor thing. It's like my grandmother was called Ziva. Right? So, Shoshana and so forth. So it's like, usually I ask in a group, what is a really old-fashioned Hindi name? What's a really old-fashioned? Like your grandmothers and great-grandmothers, they all call that, and no one else's.
Like Ganga.
Pardon?
Ganga.
Janda? Janda? Ganda? Ganda?
Ganga, the river Ganges.
Ale, Ganga. Oh, Ganga. Okay, Ganga. Okay, Ganga. So if I called my girl now Ganga, what would you think?
Sounds really exotic, actually.
Right, like, so it's beautiful. Like a little girl with little ponytails or pigtails, little Ganga, right? It's weird. We have the sense it's inherent in that name to be old-fashioned. I remember when one of my sisters, she called her daughter Matilda. And I was like, oh, poor girl. Because you run out of names. So at some point, people start calling their kids Ganga again, right? These names, these old-fashioned names, they start again becoming fashionable again. So when I was little, someone called Emma. You know, when you were the weird kind of uneducated woman, I was the Emma. I remember playing. And now little Emma was so cute and so sweet. So it all changes. It seems to have this inherent, right now Matilda, I associated with this beautiful little girl. It's no longer an old-fashioned name. So you see how names seem to be inherent in, so meaning like being old-fashioned, inherent in the name, being really modern. What's fashion? Fashion is such a good example for inherent existence, for since it's inherently nice. You see it often enough, and it becomes inherently pretty, right? You see it for the first time. It's out on the stores, and you go, oh, that's so ugly. I remember when I was like a teenager, it first came out, and then the cool girls in my school, they wore them, and suddenly it looked good, right? And then 2 years later, I'm looking at it, you know, in my cupboard. I haven't worn it. I'm like, oh, I can't wear that. I'm so not cool wearing that. So it seemed inherent in fashion, in about everything, right? Like my friends, my Tibetan friends, my Tibetan nun friends, they love flowers. Oh, they're everywhere, there are flowers. Flowers, the curtains, one type of flower, and the cups are one type of flower, and And the other day, her room is so full of flowers, and my room is like IKEA style. I grew up with it, simple. They're like, oh, it's so boring. It's all the same color, not a single flower. So the other day we talked about it, and I just said, like, I kind of jokingly made fun of her. I said, it looks like your grandmother's house, like your grandmother's room. And I'm like, and she's like, what? She said, this is pretty. Yours is boring. Mine is pretty. And I'm like, yeah, but we think that is like a grandmother. This is like an elderly woman with lots of different flowers. It's not like one design of flowers all the way, but they're here purple here, and there are roses there, and there are this there, And she's like, oh, I get it. I visited this elderly lady. She was in Australia. She met this older elderly woman, and she always goes there to help her. And she showed me this picture, and she said, yeah, look, there are flowers on this cup and flower. Oh yeah, now I get it why it's considered old-fashioned. So it's this perfect photograph. And she said, like, but I still like it. And I said, no, but it's not old-fashioned from your perspective. From our perspective, it seems intrinsically old-fashioned. So that's why we don't do it. But from your perspective, it's hip. And then she was fine with it, right? So we had this whole discussion of how we inherently feel this is nice or is not. Okay? So all our likes and dislikes, we feel like, oh, that's just my good taste. No, it is a good taste. For you, it is. In relation to you, it's good taste. In relation to my roommate, my roommate, she's not my roommate, my friend, the Tibetan nun, no, probably not, depending on how many flowers it's got, right? So what I'm trying to say is everything, and Nitsan, this example of eggs and cheese, great example. Everything seems to have this inherent, and the first step is to recognize it, right? How do we look at ourselves? As being an inherent failure, maybe, right? Or inherently better than everyone else. That's also, not just that there's inherent I. At times I feel like an inherent failure. At times I'm feeling inherently better than everyone else. Not just that, that's the thing. Within one person, you can have totally contradictory views, and every time it's inherent this and it's inherent that. Right? Inherently desirable in that person. Which is merely labeled. On the basis of how I feel, I may have a biological response, going back to lust. There may be a biological response. Hormones, don't underestimate hormones. Which is so funny. As a nun. Hormones are a big part in your 20s. I became a nun when I just turned 20, around 20, I was around. So, and then hormones. So I had to watch out for those hormones. And that was lust as well. Stay away, stay away. In my 30s, it was no longer guys. It was babies in buckets. Like around here, for the longest times, Tibetans would wash their babies at the side of the road. They would take, the rooms were too small. They didn't have a bathtub. They had these huge buckets, and they would wash their babies at the side of the road. Pretty babies, plump, and it was my hormones, like that was time to have a child, basically, in your 30s. 20s, it wasn't such a big, but 30s, babies in buckets. Oh, a baby in a bucket, just watch it. Oh, how cute, I want to cuddle that baby, right? Baby pictures, babies here, it was bizarre. It was the hormones. To a certain degree, I was not thinking of that at all. Guys and babies were out. I was focused on my studies. So I'm sure I've done my whole repression. I've repressed things, of course. And it came through in these reactions. It's really funny. It was man's arms and babies in buckets. In my 20s, it was man's arms, like muscly arms. That was it. That's all. Monks, you saw them, right? But that was... Sorry, I'm giving away too much. But no, the thing was, that was it, right? But I could feel my hormones reacting. And I had to just, okay, never mind, it's just muscles, it's just flesh, remove the first layer, and then I was I was done with it. But I reacted that way, I could tell. So we are also governed by our hormones, especially when it comes to reactions such as lust. So therefore, let's be aware of that. It is our mind and it's our body that influences our mind, which is good to know, because that accounts for also certain thoughts, not thinking, oh, I'm such a lustful person. No, I just have hormones, right? So not to identify with it too strongly. And then, as I said, later on, in my 30s, it was babies in buckets. It's ridiculous, and it wasn't every day. But I could see that I was drawn to that, and I thought it was really cute. And that, of course, that stopped again. And I had definitely repressed a few things, and therefore that came through quite strongly. But let's be aware that lust has a lot to do with hormones in the body. As you grow older, these hormones calm down, and don't have the same reaction to a certain person, depending on which gender, it doesn't matter. But the point is, there is a biological reaction, and there's a blissful feeling. There's like a feeling, and you project that on the other persons. You then label attractive. Although the reaction is over here, we now feel it's within that person. It's not just labeled, but it lies within that person. And there's a sense of permanence. That way I feel right now about them. This is how they make me feel. That's why I want to have this object. I want this. I want this. And that's how lust then leads to wanting to own the object, not wanting to be separate from it, and so forth. Of course, emotional aspects may come into it. It's not just an object of lust, but there's a whole person. All I'm trying to say is how we get there. And recognizing that is the first step to undoing it, right? It's just an emotional response, a hormonal response, which is again different for men versus women. It's different. Definitely different, yes. Okay, anyway, having said all that, I apologize for chit-chatting that long, but and I hope it didn't bore you too much, and I hope you got something out of it. But what I want to convey to you, and I'm so grateful that Nitzan also brought this in, and I'm sure you all have examples, and I wished you would come up with them, because we can learn so much from them. I won't forget what she said. That's really helpful for me as well. I may just quote you on that in the future. The thing is, it's bringing it onto exactly this level, a practical level. Yeah? Finding these examples, and it's like little pieces of a puzzle. You add more pieces, and you get a fuller sense of it. And for that, we need to contemplate. I talked to you about the toilet before. Actually, that's a classic example. I think it was the first time I heard it from Lama Yeshe, actually, using the toilet example. So, but I'm talking not about just that. We had this discussion the other day. So a lot of kind of contemporary masters talk about the toilet, but not as this, but others, I've heard them. The point is, like, there's so many times throughout the day that we can in a very relaxed fashion, reflect on that. Take every situation in your own life. Take situations you find difficult, especially when something bothers you. This is a good opportunity to kind of take what you've learned and see how you can apply this. Is it inherent? Is it intrinsic in this? Is it inherent? Really, like every situation of life, that's where you learn from. It's your own life experience. And I'm saying that Zongse Khyentse Rinpoche is such a great Lama. Remember the movie Lama? I talked about them. Because he has that ability to take any ordinary situation in life and discuss the Dharma, to apply the Dharma, and use it as examples to convey the Dharma. So you bring your daily life and the Dharma together, and you see your daily life is the Dharma. It is the Dharma. Every principle, every concept of Buddhism is found in your daily life. Your daily life is the Dharma. Whether you make it the Dharma is up to you. Whether you turn it into a pure Dharma, in other words, is totally up to us, right? But Dharma, and this is another word for reality. Okay? Dharma means truth, reality, but it also refers to the teachings, which on the basis of recognizing reality, we then remove that which is extra and not in the nature of our mind. And I've heard that you've also asked, what's next? Venerable Drokha basically discussed that some people wanted to know more about possibly meditation or what's next. And that is an important, and a very important, that's very Tibetan to repeat the second syllable to emphasize it, important point. So it's really important because in a way you feel you've changed when you leave from here, and you may be determined to make changes to your life, that when you return, everything will be different. I met people who had that sense, everything will be different. Don't expect a very, very fast change. Unfortunately, it's not as fast. And what may happen is when you get back into your ordinary environment, your usual environment, the environment you're used to, you fall back right away into your old patterns. It's totally normal. It's kind of like muscle memory. You know, you do certain things that suddenly you find yourself and you go through the motions again. Similar with our thoughts. You're back and it's like nothing has changed. But that's just the first reaction, because our mind automatically, you're in this familiar environment, you act like this, those same thoughts arise. But before long, what has happened here will come in. Allow for it to come in. It will come in. You can't make it, you can't undo it. It's happened. It's part of your mind, has become part of your mind. And although it may not be at the surface right away, but it will slowly come in. And then you keep it. Don't totally maybe read a page or two every day. Keep learning, keep reading. Books by His Holiness, I can very much recommend. They're always reliable. But then if you find a study group, if you find a place somewhere, online, there's so much now online. Maybe join a study program. Geshe Damdos, it's one of the best there is. The Nalanda study program is so good. I had the great fortune that he taught one of my classes at the IBD. He was actually an IBD monk at first, and then later on he took his degree from Drepung, but then came back and he taught us. He's an amazing teacher, and I would often go to his room and ask him questions and spend time with him. So kind. And he has this ability, he can do so much at the same time, right? A nephew would come in, they would chat, they would talk about something, then he would answer my question, then someone else came in, and it was incredible. And he's an amazing teacher. So his program, I can really recommend you, not just because of his ability to teach, but who he is, right? So yes, I'm in great support of his incredible. So joining a program like him, I always recommend that. He's an amazing teacher.
Is that the Tibet House teacher?
Yes, the Tibet House from Delhi. So amazing. You're in good hands when you follow his, because he also has got the Tibetan background, the Tibetan culture, which is beautiful, and he's taken the best from it. He's very well educated, at the same time has a healthy background in science. So you get East meets West in one person, basically. But yeah, for me, he symbolizes all the best in the Tibetans, and he has this incredible knowledge. Yes, his name is Geshe for a Geshe degree, Dorje Damdul. Dorje you spell D-O-R-J-E, Damdul I think it spells as D-A-M-D-U-L. There's actually an announcement for his course, his Bodhicitta course at the front, so you can see a picture of him as well. And he has a whole Nalanda program, which is really good, an online program. So you can join that, right? And join the program. So that I can totally recommend. Get a proper teaching on the Heart Sutra. I'm not a proper teacher. I mean, there are really good teachers out there. So please also get by a qualified teacher. Now you have a little introduction. We had some discussions on it. But get by a qualified teacher. That I can only recommend. So I've just introduced to you the ideas, but on a more profound level, you need to get teachings by a fully qualified teacher. Anyway, you can never study it enough, so it's fine to hear it over and over again. So that's my recommendation for you, to continue studying, but also use any free moment. And I'm not saying you have to sit in the corner in a quiet place, have the perfect cushion, the perfect incense. No, I mean, that is just, you spend just looking for that and have no time to meditate, just to create the circumstances. So I would recommend any opportunity, washing clothes. Okay, here in India, it's a great way. Though we have a washing machine, but we don't wash everything with a washing machine. So just kind of rinsing whatever, your socks, etc. So, me, where's the eye? Where are the socks? It's a great opportunity. And you make it a habit that at some point the Dharma is always there. You always reflect on it. And when you have a thought, especially a negative one, oh, great, I got a good example right there. My aggression, my resentment. Okay, let me analyze the situation. Why am I just seeing my perspective? What is the perspective of the other person? They want to be happy. They deserve. Why is it just me who deserves to be happy? And right away you start to, and you undo it. You learn to undo it. And you have still the habits, but you can undo them a little bit because you stop them from taking over, and days of resentment and days when you get so used to it that it's harder to undo. Right? You catch yourself in the act. Okay? And for that you need good old mindfulness and good old introspection. It all goes back to that. And we all know what mindfulness is and introspection. Now we need to apply it. First step. Even when you talk to someone, what are my thoughts? You have the time to do that. Like I said, I can teach you on emptiness and think about my laundry. If I can do it, you can do much more. Talk to another person on emptiness or whatever and check your mind. Check your mind. What am I thinking? Oh, okay. And go back. Check your mind. What am I thinking? Adjust your thoughts. Go back. Throughout the day, again and again, introspection. What is my reaction to a situation? What is the trigger? How's my reaction? Yeah, and it's so healthy. It's such a healthy approach. And you'll find you're happier, more peaceful, more satisfied. Okay, now, finally, getting out the text. If I could. All right. Okay. So let's go back to the little bit we've got left. Do we take a break? Oh my God. Yeah. It's actually totally time for a break. Let's take a 15 minutes break and then we continue with the text. Okay.
What was the name again of the documentary?
Documentary maker.
Louis Theroux. Okay, I hope